Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to attempt an explanation of the ontological argument by St. Anselm. I'm not going to critique it, I'm not going to look at some of the responses or the strengths or weaknesses of it. For that I'll just point you to the article from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which not only does a great job explaining the argument, but also giving the pros and cons or some of the responses to it. I'll put a link to that down below. Anyways, St. Anselm was an 11th century Christian philosopher, and he had a great impact on Christian philosophy and theology, and on philosophy in general. This essay, the Proslogion here, we're just looking at chapter 2. The reading is not very long, but don't let that deceive you. The ideas in it are very difficult, and I would recommend reading it and rereading it and allowing the ideas to sink in. So we'll go ahead and just look at chapter 2 very carefully and try to better understand it. He starts off with the first line, "Truly there is a God, although the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." Now we might take issue with the choice of words here. Fool refers to an atheist, but he's just quoting from the book of Psalms, chapter 14, verse 1, where the psalmist he uses the same language and refers to the person who doesn't believe in God as a fool. So the goal here that Anselm has is to convince the atheist to believe in God. He wants this to be a proof for the existence of God. Now, it might be helpful here to just explain a thing about this argument. Many of the arguments for the existence of God that we encounter in philosophy are a posteriori in nature. That means they're based on experience. So you look at nature and you see the design in it, and from there you draw the conclusion that there must be an intelligent designer, for example. This one is different. The ontological argument is a priori in nature, which means it doesn't depend upon one's observation. It's only dependent upon reason or ideas. And so just as you might infer that a bachelor is an unmarried male just from understanding the term bachelor, he thinks that if we just understand the idea of God, we will understand that God exists. So let's see if he's successful. Well, I'll leave that to you to decide. Again, I'm just explaining it here. So, all right, jumping in, he says, "We believe that thou art a being than which nothing greater can be conceived." So there's his definition of God, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. We might refer to this in short as the greatest conceivable being. He continues, "Or is there no such nature, since the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God? But at any rate, this very fool, when he hears of this being of which I speak, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his understanding, although he does not understand it to exist." He continues down below, "When a painter first conceives of what he will afterwards perform, he has it in his understanding, but he does not yet understand it to be." So what he's just saying here, I think, is that it's even the atheist or the skeptic can have in their mind the idea of God. It's not making any jump or commitment here at this point to just imagine God in one's mind. And what is it that you imagine when you think about God? The greatest conceivable being. That term refers to this idea of the greatest conceivable being. So let's admit, or maybe not, that we can imagine such a thing in our mind without making any conclusion, drawing any conclusion yet on whether the being exists. So we have that idea in our mind. Let's proceed. He says, "And assuredly, that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater." Okay, so at this point, we've got to think about that idea we have in our head now of God. This is the greatest conceivable being. Now, stop and ask yourself, this idea, this being that we have this idea of, has all the properties of greatness, right, attached to it, and it has it to their maximal amount. So the question to you is, oh, so by the way, the examples of those things include power, knowledge, and the like, omnipotence, omniscience, and other things. This being has all that. Now the question is existence a good-making property? Meaning, is it better to exist than not to exist? If your answer to that is yes, it's better to exist than not to exist, then this being that we're imagining in our mind, being the greatest conceivable being, must have that characteristic as well, right? If you think that existence is a good-making property, then the greatest conceivable being must have that property. So therefore, that being exists. Not just in your mind now. It exists actually in reality, because that's what it means to be God, is to exist in reality. Okay, does that make sense? Let's go ahead and finish up here with this last section. He says, therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, that means only in your imagination, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived, but obviously this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. In philosophy, we refer to this as a reductio ad absurdum. So what he's asking you to do is imagine in your mind the greatest conceivable being existing only as an idea in your mind. Well, he thinks if you do that, you realize that that's impossible, because if it only exists in your mind, there must be a greater conceivable being, that one that exists outside of your mind, but that's impossible. And he thinks because of this contradiction, then this greatest conceivable being must exist both in your mind and in reality as well. All right, I hope you found that helpful. Again, I refer you to the great article from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy down below.